Sorry about that. Well, I mean, you're here. All of you are here, so you've heard things up to this point. Actually, it looks like we have most students here overall, so that should be all right. And remember, raise your hand. I know I'm kind of going through each of these points really quickly. It's kind of just the basic stuff before we get into each phase of development. But for anyone watching this recording after, sorry, we've already been talking for about 20 minutes about the content. So this is where we are in the slides. We're going to just continue on. So sorry about that. All right, so here are the periods of development. This is essentially where scientists have kind of delineated the age ranges for these developmental phases. So prenatal is really easy. It's before birth. So conception to birth, there's really no argument about that time period. Infancy is considered birth to about 24 months. And then early childhood is about 2 to 5 years. Middle to late childhood is about 7 to 11 years. And this is where you start getting into some arguments between different, I say arguments, but different opinions between developmental scientists. So some might say late childhood goes into even 12 or 13. The book kind of takes this line of 6 to 11. So adolescence, some say that it starts as early as 10, some say it's not till about 13. And then it ends at about 18 to 19, and that's when early adulthood happens. So the 20s to generally the early 30s is early adulthood. Middle adulthood is about 35 to 65, and then late adulthood is about the mid 60s to death. So, as you can see, there's a lot smaller delineations here from infancy through middle childhood than there are in middle adulthood through late adulthood. So this is one problem that we'll talk about quite a few times in the class. There's a lot more research on infancy, early childhood, middle and late childhood than there is in middle adulthood and late adulthood. The focus for many, many years of developmental science has been the beginning of life. And then originally, some of the original theorists, Freud, for example, other contemporaries of Freud, thought that basically once you got to adolescence, your development was done. You're like essentially an adult at that point, and from that point on, nothing really changed. So over time, we've realized, well, that's definitely not true. There's still a lot of changes that happen through middle and late adulthood. So my guess is even in the next few 10, 20 years, that we'll see more delineations of categories that we're going to call periods of early adulthood, middle adulthood, and late adulthood. I think we're going to separate that out more and more, especially as there's a lot more research now into middle and late adulthood than there was originally. So we're doing a better job at looking at the entire lifespan, but it is kind of a problem that the field started with, is that focus on early childhood. So another area or phase of development that's currently being debated is emerging adulthood. So this is about the period from age about 18 to 25, and it's slightly controversial because we don't see it in every single culture and community in the world. So we generally see this in US, Australia, many European countries. This is about the time people are going to college and doing an undergraduate degree. So it's characterized by identity exploration, instability, more focus on self than maybe in other cultures where there's like a hard line of you're now an adult, you're expected to take on adult roles. In some ways, emerging adulthood is kind of like an extended adolescence, or is it just a different phase of adulthood that we have in these cultures? So it's a little bit controversial. I still tend to call this age range early adulthood because, yes, in some contexts, these are pretty common characteristics. We see instability and more identity exploration at this point. But as we've found even more recently, even in other cultures, people are still looking for their identity well into their 20s. And identity even changes later on through life versus years ago, let's say 15, 20 years ago, it was thought that once you got your identity at, let's say, around age 17 or something, that's kind of where it stayed. As more research is done with older adults, we see, oh, no, identity changes a lot. So the way you see yourself changes. For example, my identity changed dramatically when I became a father, so that now became a big component of my identity. Just as one example of like how identity changes throughout life. Someday I might be a grandparent, and so that would probably change my identity as well. Maybe I'll change careers, things like that. Those can all, so just one example of how things, we're realizing a lot of aspects of development are a lot more fluid, a lot more changeable than we might have originally thought or thought maybe 15 years ago. So some of the issues that we're going to be talking about in development center around these terms. You've probably heard nature and nurture, but we're also, there's always kind of this contest between as well stability and change. And this is what we were just talking about. So our characteristics, our identity, your personality, are those stable across your life, or are they changeable? Continuity and discontinuity, we'll talk about that in more detail in a minute, and then early and later experience. So what's more important, the early life or later experiences in life? So nature, nurture. Nature is when we're talking about things, development being dependent on biology. So genes, physical development, health, versus nurture is development dependent on the environment. So just in the chat box really quickly, let's get a quick vote. For you, do you think development is more dependent on nature or more dependent on nurture? So just in the chat box, put either nature or nurture. So it looks like we've got a couple votes coming in. It looks like so far nurture is the winner, but we also have a couple votes for both as well as varied, which suggests that in some situations it might be one, in some it might be another. So, but I haven't seen anyone say nature yet, unless I'm missing it. They're both words that start with N. So, all right. So I think that's. What was that?
Sorry, where is the chat? Because I'm looking for it, but I'm not finding it.
Oh, yeah, no problem. I will pull over my Microsoft Teams app. So here's what my app looks like. Yours might look slightly different. Down here, if you hover around this area, you should see these kinds of controls. So you can leave the meeting. This shows participants, so it shows who's there in the meeting at the time. It also has the conversation right here. So this is the chat box. So you can go and type a comment.
Okay, mine doesn't have that for some reason. I'll keep looking. That's okay.
Yeah. One thing you could do as well is just hang up out of the meeting and come back in and maybe leave entirely from Microsoft Teams, like close the app entirely, then come back in, because it should be available on all apps, no matter if you're using a laptop or a desktop.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll try that.
Sorry about that, though. Yeah.
That's fine.
Yeah, it does tend to be nature versus nurture. It's usually both. So depending on what it is, there's generally some combination of biology or that nature, the cognitive development, and socio-emotional development, which might be more closely related to that nurture. So some things are more from the nature side, some things are more from the nurture side. So your attachment to your parent or guardian figures, that is going to be almost exclusively from the nurture side. Your physical development, especially in early childhood, is very dependent on the nature side. So your genes and how they start to get you to grow. And then as time goes on, your diet and things like that start to affect it more. But right off the bat, it's really, really genetically determined. So stability and change. So with that, we're talking, do things stay stable through life or do they change through life? And here it's kind of the same thing. And we mentioned this a minute ago, is that some things do tend to remain stable, but many other things have varying levels of change. So a good example of this is your cognitive skills. So once you get to be about 25, 30, your cognitive skills will probably stay at that same stable point for your entire life until you get to be about 85, when they might start to drop off. But it doesn't mean that they have to be at that same place. If you do like memory exercises, you can improve your memory. If you do other problem solving things, if you take up chess, we've seen people's cognitive skills and abilities increase with those kinds of things. So just because they're stable doesn't mean that they are not amenable to change. There's always that aspect of plasticity. So continuity and discontinuity is an aspect of development. With continuity, we're talking about a constant cumulative change. You can think of this as like a steady increase of growth or a steady change over time, versus discontinuity is like growth spurts, or like quick changes in a short period of time, where it's not like a constant. You develop a new skill and then nothing changes for a while, and then you develop a new skill. So what do you think? Do you think most development is continuous, a slow, steady change, or do you think most development is discontinuous, kind of jumps to different skills and abilities? So let's vote again in the chat if you've got access to the chat. So do you think most development is more stable and continuous, or do you think it's more jumpy and discontinuous? All right, we're getting some votes in, and it looks like so far we've got almost all the votes for continuous, but we do have a vote for discontinuous. So I'm glad to see. Oh, and we have a vote for stable and continuous. Stable and continuous, that's the same thing. Sorry. Discontinuous, continuous. Great. Well, thank you for participating for sure in the class. So most people are voting continuous, a few for discontinuous. So in reality, it is very dependent on what you're talking about. Most development is pretty continuous, especially if you look at like a really small time scale. You can see little changes over time, but both do exist. So a really good example of discontinuous is actually the ability to think abstractly. So thinking abstractly, outside the box, outside the general way that you tend to look. It's hard to describe abstract thought in simpler words than that. Maybe I need to figure out a better way to do that. But that ability to think abstractly only appears when the neurological capacity of a child allows for it to. So essentially, this is a discontinuous development that the brain is still developing in a child, and then once those neurons kind of connect up in the right way, suddenly now they can think abstractly. So one day they might not be able to, the next day they do. So you might say, well, the neurons are developing, so you might say that's a part towards this, but this is a sudden change that you can see in that abstract thought. Versus continuous, usually the way we learn to read and we learn our first words, that tends to be a pretty continuous process. So an infant will make sounds, will try to mimic sounds, will say short syllable words like mama or dada, and then over time they'll start to recognize things like letters, and then they'll learn to read their name, small words, and then bigger words. So that's a really good example of something that's more continuous. Interestingly, growth in infancy and early childhood is actually physical growth. Physical growth in infancy and early childhood is actually really discontinuous. So we tend to think of like a person's height lengthening in a continuous manner, that they're just growing a little bit every day. I mean, I've even said that to my kids, like, hey, if you're eating your vegetables, you're going to be growing a little bit every day. Technically, that's a lie. They will have growth spurts. And so it's a really discontinuous development where, especially in early childhood, they might go almost a month without any growth at all. And then within about a 24 to 48 hour period, they will have a growth spurt where they can grow up to even almost an inch in really early childhood. So pretty amazing example of discontinuous development. Yeah, a lot of things tend to be more continuous, but discontinuous development does exist as well. So early and later experience. So do we think the first 5 years of life are the most important, or later experiences like early adulthood are the most important? Let's get another vote in the meeting chat. What do you think? So early experience or later experience? All right, looks like we've got quite a few votes for early and quite a few votes for both. So I think you're catching on to the theme of these points here. Early development for many things might be the most important, but for a lot of other things, later experience can be very important as well. So it is, depending on what you're talking about specifically, it could definitely be both. Like I said, early research focused on early experiences in life and how that then affected later life, as we're learning more recently, like in the last couple decades, that a lot of later aspects of life can have a bigger effect than we originally thought. So language, as we talked about last class period, is a lot easier to learn in early childhood. So for language development, for becoming monolingual, bilingual, trilingual, whatever lingual you're going to be, early experience is very important for that. For secure attachment, you generally develop your first attachment in childhood. But that being said, even if you have an insecure attachment to parents, if you then later on have a partner who you has a secure attachment and that's their attachment style, and you then become securely attached to that partner, your attachment style can change in early adulthood. So even though you might have started with, sorry about that, I just punched my microphone over. So even if you started with an insecure attachment, later on in life, you might be able to develop a secure attachment and have that be for the rest of your life. So depending on what we're talking about, it could definitely be both. So a point I want to make here when we're talking about context and the early versus later experience, nature versus nurture, is development is the way it's described in the literature is as developmental cascades. And so what it's saying is you can think of a drop or a stream of water as being an individual. And so maybe, let's say this is positive outcomes, this is negative outcomes on this side of the screen. So they might start off with a lot of protective factors, a lot of benefits. And so it looks like maybe life will end up for them really positively. But depending on the context, the supports that they have, maybe they lose supports. Maybe there's a war, or maybe there's a natural disaster, something like that. Maybe other things change so that they don't have the supports they have. That might put them on the trajectory over here, so that stream of water ends up over here, closer to maybe some more negative outcomes. So then maybe later on in middle adulthood, they get some more supports. And so it looks like to their end of life, they will now again be thriving pretty well. So any of our given contexts can bump us one way or the other. We could kind of stay in that same stream, or we could bump maybe closer towards risk factors and negative outcomes, or we can bump more towards positive outcomes and thriving. So that is the idea of developmental cascades, that through time, so time is going up, down in this picture. So as you're going through time, down here is like closer to your death, here's like closer to your birth. You're encountering different things, different people, different experiences that might push you or nudge you one way or the other. So you can definitely see with the plasticity of individuals, you could start with a lot of risk factors, very many problems around you in the context, but still end up in a really positive place with a lot of thriving. And that might be down to choices that you make, as well as things that exist in the context or supports that you can get. Another way to look at it would be this Plinko board. So if you've ever seen Plinko be played, essentially you're dropping a ball here and you kind of want it to land on a high point. a high point value, but you can think of each of these points as either a protective factor, something that helps support your human thriving, or a risk factor, something that might point you towards something more negative. So for each of these contexts, it might be pushing us one way or the other. And we as developmental scientists really want to focus, especially as applied scientists, want to help people get more to that thriving side. So doing whatever we can to kind of nudge that ball or nudge that stream of water towards the thriving area. And that's the idea of developmental cascades, that over time you can change little things or big things to change things in people's lives long down the line. So questions about that idea? I think these visual examples really help me to understand that development over time can push you in many different ways. And as scientists, we want to try to nudge people in the positive, thriving way. All right, so as we jump into talking about different theories that are around development, I definitely want to get a clear idea of what a theory is. So this is something that this is a word a lot of people tend to use incorrectly. You might have heard someone say, oh, that's just a theory, or something like that to end an argument, say, oh, well, that's just a theory. So when you say that, it's not using it as scientists use it. It is pretty commonly used in like layperson speaking about it, but that's not what we as scientists are saying when we're talking about a theory. So the definition of a theory is that it's a broad idea or set of ideas that explains and predicts observations. So we already have a lot of data, and we've already made an explanation. And so this idea or these big broad sets of ideas can explain gravity, for example, or something like that, or explain attachment theory. So it's this big broad set of ideas that already does have evidence for it. So with it, a theory has to be stated in a way that's falsifiable. And so that's kind of a new word. So what does falsifiable mean? Falsifiable means that the theory has to be stated in a way where you could prove the theory false, where it would be possible to prove the theory false. So I've got a couple funny or interesting examples of times when theories were falsified in history to give you a better idea of that. So we'll look at what a theory is, that broad set of ideas, and then how were they then falsified. So the theory of spontaneous generation was a theory that existed for many, many decades, well, many centuries actually. So the idea here, and you can watch this short clip from Bill Nye on your own, who explains this, basically explains everything I'm going to say. Maybe I should just watch that instead, but it's not really a very high quality, like high pixel video, so I decided not to watch it together. But if you like Bill Nye, do that. So essentially, the idea was that matter is spontaneously generated because of other nearby matter. So dead wood spawns or becomes mushrooms. That was the idea. That was spontaneous generation. These mushrooms were spontaneously generated because of the dead wood around them. So grain on ships. So you would want to keep the grain separate so it wasn't in big stores, because the idea was that that grain would then spawn or become mice, that one type of matter then becomes another type of matter, this living being. Another idea would be that meat just like left out will spawn or develop into flies or larvae. So reminder is that this theory is the broad set of ideas that explaining and predicting things. So the big broad idea is the idea of spontaneous generation, that matter becomes another type of matter. So the wood can become the mushrooms, that kind of thing. So it's spontaneously generating. That is the broad idea. So that's the theory of spontaneous generation. So how was this then falsified? Well, and also, so they were using the spontaneous generation theory to explain and predict things that they could observe. They would have a bunch of grain, and then all of a sudden there would be mice. So the grain must be becoming mice, or the wood must be becoming mushrooms, because that's what we observed. So that was their observations, that was their evidence, that was their explanation of these processes, was spontaneous generation. So how was it then falsified? Well, it was falsified first by Francisco Redi, showing that maggots do not spontaneously generate from rotting meat. So in an experiment, basically put a piece of meat in a open container and then had a sealed container with the same piece of uncooked meat. And what they observed was that this one had maggots and then flies, and then this one did not because it was sealed. So it was a piece of evidence that could falsify that theory. But it took more than just that one experiment. So this was in 1668. Even later on in 1859, there were still people holding on to the idea of spontaneous generation. If you think about the time period, if you try to replicate this first experiment, putting meat in sealed versus unsealed containers, you, in your current state and understanding of the world and science and bacteria and microbes and things like that, you might say, well, if this wasn't sterilized well, you might still see maggots and flies on this one, right? There might still be those organisms that got in beforehand, and so the experiment, if tried again, might fail. And that's what we actually see happening, is that when people tried to replicate it, some people found the exact same result, and some people did not. So that theory of spontaneous generation held on for still a couple hundred years. So in 1895 or 1859, Louis Pasteur boiled meat in, so he boiled the meat broth trying to get rid of anything in it, and then put one in an open flask and one with a swan neck flask. So basically it makes it so that if it was sealed and spontaneous generation was real, the one that was sealed should spontaneously generate, and showed that, well, no, it doesn't spontaneously generate, but even still, it took a while after Louis Pasteur's for people to really decide, okay, the spontaneous generation theory is not correct, and it was really at that point that they started looking at microscopic organisms. So it was actually one of the beginnings of biology and cellular biology at that point. So they had to, as well as falsify the original theory, come up with a better explanation. Figure out what is it that's causing these observations that we see. We see the meat turning into maggots, or we see organisms growing on the broth. So what explains that? So they had to make a new theory to explain that observation that didn't fit the original theory. So the original theory took a couple hundred years to be falsified, to be proved false, and it was replaced by a better theory that explained everything, explained these broad pieces of evidence more clearly. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about theories and falsification. So theory is that broad idea or set of ideas. The falsifiable, it has to be able to be proved false. So the theory of spontaneous generation, you could test it and prove it false. So you need to state your theories in a way that allow you to make studies that can either support or present evidence that your theory might not be accurate or fully explaining all pieces of evidence. So an example of a psych theory that we'll talk about is Vygotsky's sociocultural theory. So this theory, really briefly, essentially explains how people can learn. So it emphasizes culture, that a culture kind of imparts knowledge or ideas or tools, as Vygotsky called them. The culture imparts tools like math. How to do math would be an example of one of those tools. Language would be an example of one of those tools. So the culture gives people tools to then learn. So this is a model of the zone of proximal development. An idea behind this is you have aspects of things you can do. So I can read X number of words a minute. I can type this fast. Or let's maybe not take me as an example. Let's take my daughter who's currently learning to read and write and spell. She can spell some words better than me, that's for sure. So she has this certain capacity. She can do this much math, but with help with her teacher, she can do more. She can do more problems. She can do basic algebra, things like that. But there are still things, even without help, that she cannot do yet. So as she gets help, this circle of what she can do will expand, and then the circle of what she can't do will shrink. She'll kind of expand into that. So that's the idea behind Vygotsky's sociocultural theory, that the culture, that help, that scaffolding, that learning from other people will help people grow and develop certain skills. So the broad idea or set of ideas is this theory. It's combining ideas about observational learning, learning through practice. And so the theory of the sociocultural theory is that the society, the culture will impart these tools for you to grow and learn. That's the big broad idea. So is it falsifiable? Well, you could possibly find pieces of learning that didn't go through this process, right? So if people could, for example, if you could see a lot of evidence that people who had never had experience with music could pick up an instrument and play perfectly, or write music or something like that without having been trained by anybody, without having any of this help, that might suggest that maybe this theory isn't completely true in all cases. And then we would have to think, well, should we now expand or change this theory to fit that new evidence? Or should we throw away this old theory in favor of a new theory that better explains the learning process? So that's what we do with theories as scientists. So there are these big, broad sets of ideas that help us make predictions, explain the data that we do have. It's not a hypothesis in and of itself. So a hypothesis itself is a testable idea or prediction, and it's usually derived from a theory. So from the sociocultural theory, I might make a hypothesis based on that. And I might hypothesize that my child can learn some calculus if she's given help by a teacher. So based on the sociocultural theory, I might make that prediction, that hypothesis, and then I would run that test. Maybe I would say, I bet all third graders or something like that can learn some calculus if they're given specific support. And so then I test that. I get 400 third graders. I try to give them some kind of training, see if they can then do a little bit of calculus. So if that turns out that I was correct, that most of those kids did learn a little bit of calculus, that would give some support to the original theory. If it didn't turn out to be true, if I brought these kids in who had never learned any calculus and most of them just automatically could do calculus, that might suggest that the original theory was not true. So you need, just like with the spontaneous generation theory, you need quite a few pieces of evidence to fully, completely throw away the old theory. You also need a new theory to take its place. So that's generally kind of a long process to get rid of that older theory and in favor of the new one. But that is what we need to do as scientists, is to make sure we are using the best theories to explain and predict the world around us. So let's jump into, well, let's take a quick break and then we'll come and start talking about the theories that exist and started our research into developmental psychology, starting with the psychoanalytic theory. But let's take a quick break and be back at 9:30, and I'll put that in the chat box as well. And we're back. Hopefully everyone is back from our little break. Uh, Rather than talk about all the theories right now because of the time that we have, I think I'll skip over these in the lecture right now and focus on the most recent, most widely used theory. But your book does talk about these in more detail. So, for example, psychoanalytic theory, that's what Freud was doing, that's what Erikson was doing, and we'll talk about Erikson quite a few times in the class. So definitely review that in your textbook. And your textbook does go into more detail than I have in the slides. Review these slides, but because of time, I'm not going to talk about them right now. Cognitive theories, we'll talk about Piaget quite a few times through the class. Essentially, this is theories focusing on cognitive development and how people develop and think about thinking and can do cognitive processes. So it kind of ignored physical processes. Vygotsky's social cultural theory was an example of one of these cognitive theories. It looked at how do we learn, for example, and that was only one aspect of it, really. Behavioral and social cognitive theories. If you've ever trained a dog, you've probably used behaviorism, using rewards, punishments, so reinforcement. That's what we're talking about there. And sociocognitive theory is the social cognitive aspect, so what you can gain from social influence impacting your cognitive development. So the one I do want to focus on before we talk about research methods is ecological systems theories. So ecological theories are essentially saying that development reflects the influence of the environmental systems across time. So this will sound really similar to what I was saying at the beginning of class today, as I was talking about an ecological systems theory. So one of the primary ones is Bronfenbrenner's bioecological theory and Lerner's developmental contextual systems theory. So Lerner has, in some cases, some people describe it as a theory, some people just say it's a model. Doesn't matter for our purposes. I probably shouldn't have even mentioned it at this level of class. But both of them are looking at how does the environment impact an individual. So here's Bronfenbrenner's model. We've got an individual, and they're in a microsystem. So their immediate environment, people or things that they interact with on a day-to-day basis. So probably family, school, friends, workplace, neighborhood, maybe religious community. These are things that they're interacting with on a day-to-day or a week-to-week basis. So they're actually seeing and talking to their family, they're actually seeing and talking to their friends. So they tend to have, this microsystem tends to have one of the biggest impacts on their development. The exosystem over here is the things like the laws in your particular area, the political systems, the industry, the government, the mass media. So other aspects that will then affect your school, your friends, your community, but they are kind of a step removed from the individual. So the individual isn't directly affecting, probably, the mass media or the economic systems. That individual, though, is being affected by these things through their school and workplace, things like that. Then the macro system is the norms and values of the culture. So kind of that cultural context influences all of these under it. And then the mesosystem is kind of the connections that exist between the microsystem and the exosystem. So the government in a local area might have ties to, say, a religious community or a workplace, something like that. So that's what the mesosystem is, those connections between those. So hopefully this is familiar when we were talking about context earlier, and you've seen this model. This is Lerner's developmental systems theory. So this is the one I primarily use because I think visually it really emphasizes the connection between like a child and their parents or their social network. And then you can see those contexts of the community, society, and culture. So it's a model that I think is really, for me, a visual person, it's really helpful for me to focus on both fine details as well as the big picture. So when I try to think of how do we help people become more pro-social in my own research, I can look at this and say, okay, well, I need to look at, well, how does it develop over time? So what are the influences that a parent has over time or a school has over time? And then how can I influence those or try to change them or make them better so people are more pro-social in adulthood? So the big key here is this bidirectional interaction that the individual can affect people outside themselves or systems outside themselves, and then those systems can then affect them. So it can be like a positive upward spiral, or even a negative downward spiral of a child influencing a parent influencing the child, back and forth. So that can be a really positive experience and lead to thriving for both parties. Yeah, and I mentioned this. It allows those focus studies or reductionist studies as well as the big picture studies. So some positives here are that these theories, the ecological systems, are trying to get the whole picture of development over the lifespan, which is really good because it's something that was missing from a lot of earlier theories. And it also looks at those connections between individuals and their systems. And it's a hybrid between the original reductionist theories and the big picture theories. Some negatives, though, are that the research methods specifically for ecological systems, there's not very many. They're still being developed because this is a pretty new theory. It's really only been around about 15 years. So with that, there's not very many methods specifically focused on doing this whole big picture as well as fine detail at the same time. So it is really hard to integrate across the field. So I can do a single study looking at the impact of maybe a school, a parent, and a child on prosocial behavior, but that gets only a little bit of data for those couple arrows, right? So I need to then work with other disciplines to broaden that picture and do more studies. So hopefully in the future there are better ways to integrate all these things to get more data for these theories. And then there's also that practical research limit. The grants that I get to do these research projects, I cannot assess every child in the world or every adult in the world and follow them for a long period of time. So there's those practical research limitations that hopefully can be solved in the future. There's a couple interesting ideas for how to do research methods from this perspective. But as we are doing it right now, we're kind of using older research methods and kind of compiling data together, which is good and useful, but there might be better ways, hopefully sooner rather than later. The book, though, it takes an eclectic theoretical orientation. I think you can definitely tell my theoretical orientation, where I come at things from. But your book doesn't ever rely on just a single theory. It describes theories or aspects of development from multiple different theories at times. So definitely go over those other theories that we just skimmed over here in the lecture so that you're up to date on those. One thing that I really want to focus on is research methods. We have enough time to probably get through these research methods, and then the beginning of next class we'll actually do an activity where we use these research methods in small groups to try and make up your own study. So essentially imagining your own study, you've got a budget, an infinite budget, infinite time, infinite access. So think about how you might apply these to study a question that you would have within developmental psychology. So observational studies are one type of method that we use to do research. So to collect data to either support or falsify a theory. So naturalistic observation is looking at behavior in the real world. So with this, you're not likely to change behaviors very much, which is generally what you want from this. This picture is not actually a great example because a person interacting with a chimp, you're then changing their natural behavior, right? If you had, say, hidden cameras watching chimp behavior, that would be good naturalistic observation. Versus a laboratory setting would be observation in a laboratory. So you can control more variables here. Here we've got looks like adolescents at computers. Maybe they're working as a group on some project. So you can control a lot of different variables. You can have music in there or no music. You can control the heat in the room. So with that, their behavior might be altered, though, because they're being observed. They might alter their behavior because they know they're being watched. So here, you don't want the natural subjects to know they're being watched, to change their behavior in any way. Here, you can control variables better, but you might be unintentionally changing their behavior. So a survey is another type of research tool that we use. So a survey asks people what they think, feel, or understand, how they have behaved in the past or how they intend to behave in the future. So before an election, you might ask people, hey, who do you intend to vote for? That's looking at intended behavior. So many scales. So scale is a survey. So you might have a bit of like 5 questions about creativity, and that's your scale of creativity. Then another 5 questions about anxiety, and that's your scale or your questions about anxiety. So it's easy to do a lot of questions pretty quickly. So it's a good way to get a lot of data from a lot of groups. And it's easy to do statistical analyses on these kinds of data versus statistical analysis in an observational study is a little bit different. You generally have to have multiple observers and see if they all agree that they're seeing the same thing. So the stats are a little different versus here we could say, hey, on average, most people like the new teaching method we're trying to implement. Something like that. That's a lot easier with this kind of data. An interview is another kind of research method we might use. So asking a person questions. You can do an interview with a group, so doing a group interview, or you could do a one-on-one. When I've done interviews, usually it's been one-on-one. So usually asking an adolescent about their purpose in life, what things are important to them, what their family's like, things like that. So with that, you can also complete survey questions during the interview. So it's with an interview, though, you're generally going to be getting more rich or more deep data. So while on the scale, you might be able to ask them about how supportive do they feel their family is, and they might be able to mark like not supportive or very supportive. In an interview, you might be able to say something like, so can you give me an example of a time you felt your family was supportive or was not supportive? And then you get a lot more idea of, well, what does this person feel supportive is, what seems supportive to them, how is that different than other people? So you're going to get different data from each of these kinds of research methods. A standardized test is another tool that we use. So this is essentially any kind of test that's standardized across a population. So the Stanford-Binet IQ test is one of the better IQ tests, and it's trying to be standardized across a US population. Sometimes this includes surveys. With this, you should be able to compare scores from one person to another person. So on a standardized SAT test, you should be able to compare scores on, say, math or English. So that's kind of the purpose of that, is that you get this score, you can run stats on it, and you can also compare participants to each other. A case study is, you've probably heard of case studies in the realm of medicine, so that you might want to look at a case of some strange disease or problem that a person has. So generally a case study is a really in-depth study of a single individual or a single case. So if someone has a brand new disease that's never been seen before, you'd probably do a case study to really try and dive in and understand exactly what's going on here. Is this disease contagious? How did they get it? What is it doing to their body? So it's very in-depth. But a case can be more than just an individual as well. It can be a group, a small group, or even a larger group. So this is a class, I forget where they were from. Basically, in this community, these young people created their own, basically, club. So they didn't have any outside support from parents. They created their own kids club, and they set up their own fort that became better. They built it up themselves. And so a case study looked at this group. I should really always just double check, because when I review the slides, I'm like, oh yeah, I like talking about that one. But then when I get to class, sometimes I forget those details. I should just put it in my notes. So it's always there. It might be, actually. Anyway, the point is that this whole group, it's a really unique situation where without any kind of outside support from parents or community members, these children created their own group, their own hierarchy or way of organizing, their own government in this little situation to decide what they wanted to do within their community. So a study looked at this as a case, as a group, an individual group that was doing something very different than we generally see. So a case can be an individual or it can be a group. You might even look at a case study of, say, a business that seems to be doing something really differently or uniquely or unusually. So other ways that we can do research is with physiological measures. So physical measures, blood pressure, height, temperature. We can use things like fMRI, looking at electromagnetic waves in the brain to see our own biochemical activity when we're responding to questions about maybe prosocial behavior. Maybe you show someone a video that of happy running dogs and see what kind of brain activity they have, and then show them what is it, that Sarah McLachlan commercial with the sad dogs, and see how their brain activity changes there. Sorry to remind everybody of that. You can look at things like heart rate and hormones like cortisol to look at how brains and bodies are processing and changing when having different experiences. So those are physiological measures. So these measures, these physiological measures, are being used more and more today in psychology. Why do you think that is? So as a reminder, this includes things like fMRIs, hormone checking, things like that. So why do you think we're currently using that more and more? So feel free to raise your hand and take over the mic.
I think it's because that way you can see what's going on in your body while things happening at the same time. Like what's the real, how can I say? Like what's really happening? I don't know how to explain that. Sorry.
No, I think that's a good start of that for sure. So what's really happening like within a body, so maybe what's really happening within your brain. I see Hannah also had a hand up. Do you want to take over the mic? And then I see Marina as well. So maybe we'll go Hannah and then Marina.
Yeah, I was just going to say that perhaps it's less biased than like a lot of the previous theories, and we can take some of the human bias out of the actual research, I would guess.
Yeah, that's a really good idea. When we think about an observational study, you have, say, me and a bunch of other researchers watching a situation saying, hey, well, this is how I describe what's happening. This is what I think might be happening. And yeah, when you look at a heart rate or a hormone level, that's a lot less able to have that kind of error come into it, unless your test of hormone level has errors in and of itself, which they all have a little bit of error. But yeah, you're taking that human kind of some of that human error out of that. Very good. Then Marina, go for it.
My thought was response is coordinated to our mental response. And so if they're taking the physical response, they can have a better idea of how the brain is reacting.
Yeah, I think that goes back to what Daniela was mentioning earlier, that you can see what is happening in the brain, what is happening in the body. It gives you a better explanation of, well, when you see something that makes you want to act pro-socially, what all is happening, what brain areas are being active, and then what hormones does it put into your body, those kinds of things. Very good. Yeah, great. So these kinds of physiological measures are really useful for doing just that, for looking at how neurological processes start or physiological processes start the process of maybe making decisions, getting things like heart rate and hormone level and an fMRI help us really well to see which parts of the body and brain are doing that and take out some of that human element. I mean, there's definitely still humans looking at saying, okay, and looking at the statistics and trying to describe them, but it's maybe not as possible to have the same problems as, say, a naturalistic observation. So yeah, with that being said, though, all of these aspects of data collection can be useful. So I mean, if we had an infinite budget, if we had infinite access to all these measurement tools, another reason we're doing more physiological measures as well is that they're cheaper now than they were before. So fMRI machines used to cost, I mean, they still cost a massive amount of money, but they're more affordable now than they were 15 years ago. So as these tests are easier to do and cheaper to do, we can do them more. So if we had an infinite amount of money, infinite amount of time, what would be the best would probably to take all possible measures of anything. So all possible measures of how someone feels when they're pro-social, asking them questions, looking at their neurology, giving them surveys, all of these things at the same time. But obviously we can't do that. People have their own time. We have those time constraints. We don't have infinite money to do this research. So we try to do our best to get the right method to answer the questions that we have. So we'll talk a little bit more about research methods at the beginning of class next time, and then do a little activity where you'll kind of come up with your own study, assuming you had infinite money to answer some research questions. But thank you very much for being here today. If you still have questions, feel free to stay after class and ask them, or email me questions and I can cover them next time in class. But thank you very much for being here.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Thanks, Brian.
Thank you.